Okay then, so welcome everyone. So I'm Mariana, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about how we handle multi-tenancy in one of our projects. So basically like a startup guide for if you need to set up multi-tenancy in your project, just from the Directus point of view, but hopefully it'll help you like make the process a little less painful. Let's put it that way. So yeah, I'm Mariana. I'm a software developer at Iberos. I've been at the company for a year and 8 months, I think. And this is Jalil, who is not here. Unfortunately, he was going to be co-presenting with me, but something came up, so he's easier in spirit. So, and without any further delays, let's just get right into it. So basically, the structure of the talk will be like defining multi-tenancy, so what it is, then the advantages, why you might need it, why it may make sense for your own projects. Then basically we'll do a small case study of one of our own projects where we had to implement multi-tenancy, how we approached it, how we got started, and also the downsides of our approach, and some other like general topics that also came up while we were doing this implementation. So yeah, let's get right into it. So basically, multi-tenancy is an architecture where you have essentially one single instance to serve multiple clients. So let's say you want to set up a CMS for schools to set up their own blog content. With multi-tenancy, you can also only one instance of Directus and serve all of the schools you want, while having the data co-located but separated from each other. So each school would only see the information that pertains to their own school. But like, why would you want to do that? Why not just set up individual instances for each school that would like to use your services? So maybe you want to lower infrastructure costs. So in some situations, and I will stress the some part of the sentence because it's very dependent on the context, it may be cheaper to just have one single instance if you don't like expect any crazy loads. So the problem here is that sometimes scaling up just one instance may be more cumbersome than just having several single instances separated and deployed individually. So yeah, as I said, this is very much depends on the context. For our case, it made sense, but it may not make sense for yours. So another possible benefit is that it can lower the entry barrier for your potential clients. So, and this is actually one of the reasons why we also choose this. So let's say we have a client that wants to use your product, but they don't really want to worry about the infrastructure. So they don't want to deploy anything, they don't want to run any infrastructure, they just want you to take care of all of it. And let's say you also don't really have the resources to have multiple instances. Multi-tenancy can help with this. Like a good compromise could be to just bear the costs of one single instance that can support multiple tenants, and so you can also support multiple clients at a lower cost. And finally, this isn't really a reason that that resonated with us for our context, but it may resonate with you. It can make it easier to kind of aggregate data. So let's say you want to see which features of your CMS are being used the most often by the most clients. It's easier when you just have your data co-located. And again, we don't really have a lot of experience with it, but it may be something that you are interested in. So let's say these benefits did convince you to try out multi-tenancy. I thought it would be the best to kind of look at a real life example, and that's why we're going to use our project that my team is currently working on as an inspiration. So Direct, which is kind of similar to Directus, and it sometimes gets confusing when we talk about the project in a company, is a platform that we're developing for Freie Universität Berlin. And it's basically focused on the management of psychological studies. So it's basically a one-stop shop for coordinating a study, creating content for a study, distributing that content to potential study participants. Like one example of a possible psychological study could be like to analyze the impact of an immigration process in an asylum seeker, for example. So where does multi-tenancy come into play in our product? So the main goal of our clients of Freie Universität was to be able to offer the platform to other partners, so think other universities, without having to ask them to set up their own infrastructure. So FO would bear the cost of the infrastructure and would offer the platform to other clients. But Freie Universität also didn't really want to push their own infrastructure costs too much. So the goal was to lower their own infrastructure costs and make it easier for other clients to adopt the platform. And so if these requirements kind of match up nicely with the advantages that I listed above, so we kind of went ahead and implemented multi-tenancy for this. So before we get started actually looking at the implementation, a quick side note. So today we'll be focusing on multi-tenancy just from a CMS point of view. However, your project and as our own did probably has more moving parts. So there are more places where you have to implement multi-tenancy, and there are more places where you have to set up systems that guarantee that multi-tenancy is ensured on your entire platform. So Direct itself is composed of several different systems. So we have a CMS to create the content. We have an app that is used by the study participants. We have an admin panel that's used by the coordinators, and then an API to kind of tie it all together. So we had to do a lot of changes in all of these on all of these parts of the app. So today we're going to look at a small subset of multi-tenancy, obviously focused on Directus. And hopefully it'll be at least like a starting point for you to kind of go through with implementing multi-tenancy on at least one part of your product. So yeah, with that said, let's jump right into it. So when you Google Directus multi-tenancy, there are not a lot of results. There's not one major guide that pops up as being super relevant for your use case. We have a couple of GitHub issues, a glossary entry in the Directus website. We also have more discussions, more GitHub discussions down further. So let's maybe look at the glossary entry for multi-tenancy. So this entry provides a very similar definition to the one that we looked at previously, but it adds some Directus-specific details. So basically, it adds the two main ways that you can achieve multi-tenancy in Directus, so either through project scoping or through role scoping. So we, for our product, opted for role scoping because project scoping was just not a viable option for us. We self-host, and we weren't really, it wasn't really viable to deploy multiple instances of Directus as a project scoping approach does. But maybe if you happen to use Directus Cloud, then yeah, this definitely could be an option. It's just a disclaimer that we opted for role scoping because it's self-host, and at the time, it was the most reasonable option. So in this presentation, I'm going to showcase a slightly modified approach of the role scoping. So basically, instead of using one role per tenant, we're going to assign tenants to users. We found this approach to be a bit simpler, and it is also one that is kind of promoted by Directus as one of their more or less recent videos that talks about multi-tenancy. But both options are obviously good, and it's just context dependent. There's not much to one over the other. So regardless of which approach you choose, either assigning tenants to roles or to users, the main concept to keep in mind is permissions. So in our approach, the tenant-based permissions are the core of the logic. So essentially, it's these permissions that allow us to filter which items a user has access to based on the tenant of that item and that user. So let's maybe, to kind of make it easier to visualize this, let's take a look at how the data is structured. So in this approach, we have a tenants collection, as a matter of fact, which allows you to define the tenants. So in a real-life scenario, which is what we do, this creation, the CRED permissions for the tenants are limited to the super admin role, and which is something that you also might consider because the tenants are this is a very privileged collection. So after we create the tenants collection, we also need a way to actually assign the tenants to things, to tenants and to users and other collections. So we create one-to-many relations between the whichever collections you want to be multi-tenant and to the user's collection as well. So now we can assign tenants to things and to users, but we don't have data segregation at this point. So a user from one tenant can see data from another tenant. So, but first let's maybe look at permissions. So users belong to roles, and roles can have many permissions. And these permissions basically dictate how the roles can interact with the collections. So let's say we have a customer role, and we have an admin role. We may want to prevent the customer role from creating in tenants while allowing the admin role full CRUD permissions to the tenant collection. So you may have noticed that in these two diagrams, the permissions collection doesn't really have a connection with the tenants. So how do we actually create the tenant-based permissions that our system depends on? So to put it all together, we kind of need the last piece of the puzzle, which are rules, permission rules. Rules allow you to make this the permissions more specific. So in this case, we're adding a rule that states that the user can only access an item in a collection if their tenant matches a tenant of that item. So let's say this is a permission for the customer role to read from the products collection. So this is basically the gist of how a multi-tenancy solution with user permissions goes. So you may be aware that also besides the data structure, there's also the question of actually creating. Sorry.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
Isn't it pretty tedious to like assign this like rule to every single like
Exactly. We're gonna cover this right in the next slide. So as like you said, it's very tedious to set up roles and permissions automatically, especially if you have like multiple deployments of the application. So and it's tedious and is also error prone. So if you forget to add a permission to a CRUD collection, then you're going to be using your app and then you're going to be like scratching your head trying to understand why is this not returning the items correctly when I create, because I know that I created the collection, why are they not showing up? So you know, it's very error prone and it's very tedious. So because we have a lot of collections and because we have several deployments like in review apps and in staging and production environments, we kind of set up automated permissions through scripts. So we don't use hooks for this, we use external scripts. But the concept is the same. So using the Directus SDK, we fetch all of the collections that should support multi-tenancy. So in this case, we check the collections that have a tenant field. And then we update the Directus permission system table to include all of the permissions that we want to support. And ensuring that the permissions field specifies that the rule that we looked at a few slides ago is enforced, which ensures that users can only access, can only do specified actions, either reading or writing or sharing on the items that belong to their own tenant. And in addition to our own collections, you can obviously do this also to system collections. We also do it with files and folders, because they should be tenant-specific as well. And the logic is fairly similar, you just have to change the target of that permission. And so with this basic data structure and with these automated permissions, we can have a simple multi-tenancy to start with. And as useful as we found this setup to be, this approach kind of does come with some downsides, and I would highlight two. So the first one would be complexity. So setting up a multi-tenant system is inherently more difficult, especially if you have more than just a CMS. And in the multi-tenancy system, as is our own case, we also have to add additional features, like our clients also wanted a multi-tenant, kind of were for a multi-tenancy approach because they wanted customization. They wanted their tenants to be able to customize the UI, they want to customize the way that the study flows. So it's more complexity to wrap your head around. It's just overall a harder solution to implement. And secondly, because the data is collocated, at least in this approach, we need to pay even more attention to security, especially if you're handling very sensitive data like medical data. We're placing a lot of trust in this multi-tenancy system, so this comes at a cost. We need to implement more systems, more checks to make sure that the data really is segregated, and that we can ensure our clients that no tenants can see sensitive information from other tenants. As with everything, basically multi-tenancy has trade-offs, and there really isn't one clear-cut rule that can tell you whether you should or should not implement a multi-tenancy. For us, at the time, it made sense, and it still continues to make sense. We're still working on it, we're still iterating on it, and it may or may not make sense for your project. But hopefully this brief intro will kind of at least settle some, give you some stronger ground to thread when you start exploring this topic. And we're almost done, but before we go, I'd like to circle back on what I said a few slides ago. So this brief guide, let's put it that way, is meant as a starting point to multi-tenancy. So there are a lot of topics which I definitely did not cover today. Some things we have come across in our product and we have solved them. Others which we have encountered and decided that we don't really have the resources, or it doesn't really make sense to tackle them right now. And surely, like many other topics, we are not even aware of. So I gathered a few here, like a few topics of discussion just for examples. So how do you handle uniqueness across tenants, for example? So let's say you have a books collection, and in the schema of that collection, you have an ISBN, so the unique code that is attributed to books, field that is set to unique. And then two of your tenants have the same book, and the first tenant tries to add that book to a collection, and it's all fine. And then the second user in another tenant tries to add a book, and an error is thrown, because the field is supposed to be unique. So how do you handle this situation? So you can maybe set up a composite index, so that the unique constraint applies only to the ISBN tenant pair and not just the ISBN. But as far as I know, this is not natively supported in Directus, so you would have to do some workarounds, you'd have to implement some custom interface to show that, but it is a possibility. Or you can even remove the unique constraint if you think that it doesn't really compromise the integrity of your data schema. It can be easier to just remove the constraint if you can ensure that the system is still compliant with your architecture. And what about tenancy outside of Directus? I did mention before that we have several other systems in our platform. So how do you sync up the tenants collection with external services? So you can set up scripts that run periodically and sync the necessary information, which is what we do. Or you can also make use of Directus hooks, which is also something that we are considering, and something that possibly we will start adopting. And what about permissions? Like, how do you keep permissions up to date? If a new collection is added, it's just as cumbersome to set up all of the permissions at once as it is cumbersome to, like, every time you add a collection, you need to make sure that all of the permissions are set up correctly. So in our use case, the automation for this wasn't really worth the effort, but you can also adopt a similar approach to the tenancy that I mentioned in the point above. And finally, like I said previously, we are following a user-based tenancy as opposed to a role-based one. But as I said, both options are viable. I've linked some discussions in the appendices of this presentation that do go further into this topic if you're interested. But yeah, I'm sure there are many more topics that we haven't really had a chance to cover, but hopefully this is a good starting point for the discussion. And I do hope that this presentation kind of provided you with a solid introduction to multi-tenancy. and that it can make its implementation a little bit less painful. And yeah, I think that's it. Thank you all for listening. I left my email there if you're interested in just asking whatever about the presentation, about the product, or whatever you can think of. And yeah, if you have any questions, then let me know. If you don't, then that's fine. I won't get mad. But yeah, thank you.